This episode contains graphic descriptions of crime scenes which may be disturbing to some listeners.
Today we're bringing you a special episode. It's a cold case from the annals of history. The unsolved murder of Jack Diamond, a well-known gangster and bootlegger whose own life was cut short by one of his many enemies. But the question is, which one?
This is APB Cold Case. Here's your host, former police chief Mark Spahn.
Our story begins on the evening of December 17, 1931 in Albany, New York. 34-year-old Jack Diamond is in a cheerful mood as he heads over to the Kenmore Hotel on North Pearl Street to celebrate a personal victory with some friends and colleagues. Now, this is during the time of Prohibition in the United States, when the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages is illegal. The law was in effect from 1920 until it was repealed in 1933. But just because it was illegal during that time didn't mean you couldn't find it. And in fact, on that very night, Jack Diamond was said to be quite drunk. After leaving the Kenmore, he heads over to his girlfriend's apartment in Tenbrook to spend some quality time. From there, he gets a cab back to his place on Dove Street, where he promptly falls asleep. But during the night, someone slips quietly into his room, and they fatally shoot him 3 times. So who was Jack Diamond, and why did somebody want him dead? To find out, we need to go back to the beginning. Jack Diamond was born in Philadelphia in 1897 to poor Irish immigrant parents. He grew up in a depressed neighborhood in Philadelphia, no doubt learning how to survive, and making a name for himself as a tough kid on the streets of a big city. In 1913, he moved to New York City, where he ran with a tough crowd and became progressively more involved with crime and eventually guns. He had several nicknames. The most infamous was Legs, which some say came from his prowess in stealing from trucks along the New York City waterfront and sprinting away before being caught. Author Dennis Foley has been fascinated with the history surrounding Diamond, which began when he lived in the apartment right next door to where the gangster once lived. Here's Dennis.
He was very fast. He was really fast, and they called him Legs.
Another nickname, Clay Pigeon, came from having been shot in at least 4 separate attempts on his life. It seemed that fortune followed him wherever he went. But how long could his luck last? Now, it was well known that Legs could be charming with the ladies. In fact, he had a very lovely wife, Alice, and an even more beautiful mistress, well-known showgirl Marion Kiki Roberts. He also associated with notorious figures like Arnold Rothstein, considered by some to be the father of modern gambling. During the era of Prohibition, Diamond sought to capitalize on the illegal liquor industry, and he wasn't afraid of challenging others who might be interfering with his own plans. He was a real tough guy, and being involved with cutthroat underground networks involving illegal alcohol and narcotics could bring someone like Legs Diamond great rewards during Prohibition, but it also brought greater risk. So it's now the 1920s, and Diamond has really made a name for himself. In fact, he reached the status of notorious gangster. His name often appeared in the newspapers connected to various crimes. Gangsters were the bad boy rock stars of their time. They gained fame and influence based on not just the crimes they committed, the neighborhoods they controlled, and the territory they claimed, but also on how sharply they dressed, the cars and the homes that they owned, by the women they surrounded themselves with, and of course, how much muscle they had. This era of Prohibition saw the creation of a network of bootlegging operations to fill public demand, and Diamond was right in the middle of it. By my count, Legs Diamond was the target of 5 shootings in his lifetime. A lot of people wanted him dead. Published reports said that Diamond was shot the first time in 1924 when he tried to hijack a liquor truck. The second incident was in 1927 when Legs was substituting for his brother Eddie as a bodyguard for bootlegger Jacob Organ. One newspaper proclaimed that Diamond was extremely competent at slugging and intimidating, which drew the attention of Jacob Organ, known as Little Augie, who was involved in labor racketeering and bootlegging. Little Augie needed protection, so Legs Diamond became his bodyguard. That is, until a drive-by shooting in which Little Augie and Legs Diamond were both shot. Little Augie died, but Legs survived. Diamond would go on to serve as a bodyguard to gangster Arnold Rothstein, until Rothstein was also cut down by bullets at the Park Central Hotel in New York City in 1928. Legs was not injured in that shooting. Which brings us back to December 1931. Legs Diamond was on trial for the kidnapping of James Duncan and Grover Parks, who were both reportedly beaten and tortured. These two guys were supposedly muscling in on Diamond's liquor peddling operation. The two victims testified before a grand jury that it was Legs Diamond and two of his enforcers, John Scaccio and Jack Dalton, who were responsible for their kidnapping. But after a 4-hour deliberation which pitted state witnesses against Diamond's alibi witnesses, the jury found the gangster not guilty. Diamond's enforcer, John Scaccio, wasn't as lucky. He was convicted on the same evidence used to prosecute Legs and was sentenced to 15 years. Jack Dalton had apparently fled, and there's no record about any prosecution for his role in the kidnapping. But Legs wasn't out of the woods yet, because the charges of coercion and possession of a weapon in the same incident were going to be tried under a different indictment and would be heard about 5 months later in a separate trial. At that trial on December 17, 1931, a jury again found Legs Diamond not guilty. Legs seemed untouchable, and as you heard at the beginning of this episode, he celebrated his acquittal at a party at the Kenmore Hotel that same night. The festivities lasted into the early morning hours of December 18, 1931. Dennis Foley explains.
Legs, after he got exonerated, he went to the Kenmore and he was drunk. He goes and spends some time over with his girlfriend in Tenbrook. One of his cohorts gets a cab for him, the cab he always uses, and they take him over to Dove Street.
After Legs is dropped off at the Dove Street rooming house where he lives, he goes upstairs to sleep it off, until someone enters his room. Here's Dennis Foley.
They just shot him in the head 3 times. They leave. The landlady said she heard 2 men talking, said, "Did you think we killed him?" And he said, "Well, we shot him in the head." And he said, "Well, let's go back to make sure." And he said, no, let's go. They got in a red Packard. Someone has seen them getting in a red Packard. I interviewed a newsboy. He said they looked like cops to him, the detectives in Albany with the beautiful fedoras. They dressed impeccable in suits.
The Ogdensburg Republican Journal newspaper reported that one of the bullets that ended Legs Diamond's life ripped through the base of his skull, and the other 2 shots were fired into the side of his head near the right ear. The Glens Falls Times, published the day of Legs Diamond's death, reported that a pearl-handled pistol was found wrapped in a handkerchief along with a flashlight just a few blocks from Diamond's apartment. Police said that 3 rounds had been fired from the pistol. The Albany district attorney said that it was that pearl-handled revolver he believed to be the murder weapon in the Diamond slaying. He even said that the pistol was his best clue, but there were never any reported results of ballistics or fingerprints relating to the gun or the flashlight. Police continued the investigation into Diamond's murder. Published reports said that a man named Sylvester Hess was questioned, having ridden part of the way in the cab with Legs after leaving his girlfriend's place. The landlady of the rooming house where Legs lived was also questioned by police, and of course they also wanted to talk with Kiki Roberts, who had reportedly fled to Boston after Legs' murder. So who were the suspects in this unsolved murder? Well, the list is long. News reports of the day said that Legs Diamond was at war with other gangsters, and anyone who was competing with him in the illicit liquor trade. But let's not forget, he was also at constant war with the police. I spoke with Greg Veach, a retired chief of police and the author of 2 books on gangster life in Saratoga Springs, New York, about 35 miles from Albany.
Legs is prominent because of all the stuff he was involved in and his high-profile trials and his girlfriend, Kiki Roberts, the showgirl. He's one of those famous gangsters.
Of course, it was a sign of power and prestige for Legs to date a famous dancer. Marion Roberts, known professionally as Kiki, was a leading Ziegfeld Follies showgirl, one of the elaborately costumed performers from early 1900s Broadway. Greg Veach believes there's a pair of gangsters who should be at the top of the list of suspects in Legs' murder: Irving Bitts and Salvi Spitali.
It would seem to me, he had so many gangland enemies that, in my view, that's probably the most likely. He's got the Bitts and Spital connection. Those guys kind of fly under the radar. They're not as prominent as, say Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano. So a lot of those guys are the ones that do the dirty work and kind of don't have their name mentioned. Bitts and Spatel, they certainly have been, should be near the top of the list. I mean, they were taken for a lot of money by Legs, and he just never paid them back, and didn't seem like he was making any effort to. They were not to be trifled with, for sure.
While Bitts and Spitali might not have the same notoriety as Meyer Lansky or Lucky Luciano, Greg Veach said that both were well known and well respected in gangland circles. So much so that they reportedly assisted authorities during the investigation of the infamous kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby.
They served as sort of the go-between in negotiations to get the Lindbergh baby back before it was obviously found dead. But so they were prominent enough to fill that role, but they weren't as flashy as someone like Dutch Schultz or Legs Diamond or Lucky Luciano. I sort of tend towards this being a gangland rub out. I lean towards a gangland slant myself. Little Augie Carfano, yep, he's another one that was implicated in a number of different murders. And he's like that second tier gangster that he was associated with Al Capone early on. He was partners with Bitts and Spatel in a few things. And, he rises to be the number two man in I think it's the Lucchese crime family. In 1957, he was gunned down in a scene that I think The Godfather borrowed from real life, where they get a phone call and he runs out with his girlfriend and then they get ambushed. He was that sort of level gangster, but not as prominent as the others, and implicated in, I would guess, maybe half a dozen murders over the course of his career, but never captured, never tried or charged for any of them.
While Greg Veach leans toward the theory of a gangster versus gangster rub-out, he doesn't dismiss the possibility that it was the Albany Police Night Squad who took out Legs Diamond. Other suspects mentioned include Dutch Schultz, an associate of the organized crime pioneer Arnold Rothstein, the Oley brothers, described as local thugs, and Red Cassidy, another Irish gangster of the day. And we can't forget about Legs Diamond's wife. Here's Greg Veach.
And we're not even talking about the fact that Alice Diamond, Legs' wife, was in the middle of breaking up with him over her jealousy with Kiki. And she would certainly have connections to the gangsters. She would know his friends and enemies and how to get a hold of them. She was murdered unsolved as well. Not too long after Legs died, Alice was shot and killed in her apartment. She tried to cash in on her fame being Legs Diamond's wife and did like a play and toured a little bit.
Dennis Foley told us about author Bill Kennedy, who wrote both fiction and nonfiction accounts about Legs Diamond.
Bill Kennedy tried to get in touch with Kiki Roberts, and he got some contact with someone who knew her, and she reviewed his book on Legs. So she reads Bill's book and says, not everything you said was true. He really was much crueler and cold-blooded than you depicted him. Kennedy depicted him pretty cold-blooded. And of course, Kennedy retorted, well, it was a work of fiction. So, of course, everything wasn't right. But he wrote again what he considered the truth about Legs Diamond in a book called Oh, Albany. He puts the blame on the Albany Night Squad.
Before we dive into the theory of the police killing Legs Diamond, we need to understand the politics in Albany in the 1920s and 30s. The Democratic Party boss in Albany at the time was a man named Dan O'Connell, and he was not going to stand for an outsider, Legs Diamond, coming in to interfere with their own operations. According to Bill Kennedy's book, in which he interviewed Dan O'Connell in the 1970s, O'Connell said that in order for the mafia to come into Albany, they would need protection from the Democratic Party, and he was not about to let that happen. O'Connell said that he sent word to Diamond that there was no way he was doing any business in Albany, and he wasn't welcome there. O'Connell added that Albany Police Sergeant William Fitzpatrick told Legs he'd kill him if he didn't stay out of town. So Dennis Foley poses some interesting questions about the circumstances leading up to Legs' murder.
The other thing is interesting is, how did the police know that Legs didn't lock the door? I assume they had a key. You know what I mean? I assume they had a key. So Legs is out And the Albany police did warn Legs not to operate in Albany. And the people who warned him was a guy named Fitzpatrick, who was a lieutenant, and McIlvaney, another detective.
Legs had so many warnings. So why didn't he listen? Was it his ego? Did he think he was invincible? Dennis Foley takes us back to the night of the murder. Legs had just been dropped off outside his rooming house.
Climbs the stairs, takes off his watch, puts it on the bureau, and just falls asleep. What's interesting about that little scenario was that he had two bodyguards with him all the time. They were Ward of Elite policemen. One was a sergeant, who later becomes lieutenant. He didn't show up. And there's another one was another police officer. He didn't show up. So for that one day, Legs had no bodyguards. There's very few people who can tell your bodyguard not to do it. You know what I mean? But the Democratic Party could tell you anything in Albany because they controlled the city. They controlled the illicit and a lot of the licit. So how do we know that it was the Albany police? You know, if you look at all the stuff that you read, they'll say Dutch Schultz, they'll say Fats O'Brien killed him. There's a whole bunch of series of people who could have done it. Lucky Luciano, anyone, But I thought of the Albany police because Bill Kennedy, the author Bill Kennedy, who wrote the book, the fiction book Legs, and a nonfiction account of it contained in Albany.
If it was the Albany Police Night Squad that pulled off the murder of Legs Diamond, Sergeant Fitzpatrick and Detective McElvaney were in key positions on the night squad, heavily influenced by Democratic Party boss Dan O'Connell. Again, Dennis Foley.
And Kennedy's thesis was that Fitzpatrick killed him. Fitzpatrick was a sergeant, becomes lieutenant, and then after Legs is killed, a little while later, he becomes chief. That's a rise. Very. McIlvaney is his partner, is in the night squad. When Dan was old, he asked Dan, and Dan said Fitz did it.
When Dennis Foley bought the Dove Street house next to where Legs Diamond once lived, he bought it from Charlie Loftus.
I was living in 65 Dove. I bought Loftus's house, and I talked to his widow, and she thought that the police had done it. I lived the house adjacent to him, and Dan picked the detectives on the night squad, and they would have to report what they did every evening to Dan. Dan did not want Legs in Albany.
So who killed Legs Diamond? The pool of suspects is deep. There were several people with motives ranging from retribution to political disruption, bootlegging competition, and jealousy. No one was ever charged with the murder of Legs Diamond, but let's take a look at what happened to some of the suspects mentioned over the years. Police Sergeant Fitzpatrick was later promoted to Chief of Police, believed by some to be his reward for killing Legs Diamond. And in a twist, Chief Fitzpatrick was killed in his own office in 1945 by police detective John McElvaney. The detective was convicted and sentenced to prison. At the time Chief Fitzpatrick was killed, the governor's special prosecutor was investigating crime in Albany County. News reports say that the prosecutor told the DA there was no connection between the slaying of Fitzpatrick and anything that his office was investigating. The man who was said to control everything in local politics, Dan O'Connell, died in 1977 at the age of 91. The New York Times covered his death, saying that he was one of the last of the old-time bosses, a man who dominated politics in Albany since 1922, a man who survived state and federal gambling investigations, although he did serve a 90-day jail sentence for contempt after refusing to testify before a grand jury. Now, let's talk about Legs' wife, Alice. A published report said that she'd been practicing marksmanship at shooting galleries to avenge her husband's death, but before she could do that, Alice was shot and killed in her Brooklyn apartment on July 1, 1933. She was 33 years old. There was speculation that she was forever silenced by her late husband's enemies. One news report said that there were 50 detectives investigating her death. 1 month after Alice died, her bodyguard was murdered at a New York City cafe. And in 1938, suspect Edward Kenny, one of the several men questioned in the murder of Legs Diamond, was shot and killed in a New York City bar. Diamond's girlfriend, Marion Kiki Roberts, faded from the headlines. In a newsreel interview after Legs' murder, she said she was going home to be with her mother. There's no public report of her death. And 2 of the other suspects in Legs' murder, Bitts and Spitali. Irving Bitts was kidnapped in 1981. He was 78 years old at the time. There was a ransom demand, and despite the payment of $150,000, Bitts was strangled and his body pulled from a Staten Island beach about 3 weeks after his abduction. Newspapers still called Bitts a prime suspect in the murder of Legs Diamond on orders from Dutch Schultz. Salvia Spitali died at the age of 82 in Florida. And finally, it was in 1939 in Spokane, Washington, a man named Arthur J. Dowling claimed that he was the one who killed Legs Diamond. He told police that he had once done prison time in New York, but reports of the day didn't show that police had any interest in the man's supposed confession. It appears that this cold case will never be solved. But if there ever had been an arrest made in the murder of Legs Diamond, the trial would have certainly been interesting. With so many people who had actually shot him and others who wanted him dead, it seems there would have been a lot of reasonable doubt.
Thanks for listening to APB Cold Case. Tell us about your cold case at apbcoldcase@spawngroup.com. APB Cold Case is an original Spawn Group production.